Welcome to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. The point of these videos is to give you a brief overview of the reading each week, to put you in a position to write your papers. First, I'd like to introduce you to the two main texts for this course, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and Kant's Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. Kant first published the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, after spending 10 years working on writing it. When Kant's contemporaries read the critique, they found it completely unintelligible, to the point of being unreadable. The very first published reviews of the critique assimilated Kant's idealism to Berkeley's. So in order to provide an introduction to the critique and to distinguish his own transcendental idealism from Berkeley's phenomenalism, Kant wrote the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. It was published in 1783. But Kant thought that the critique could still be improved, so when its second edition came out in 1787, he completely rewrote the transcendental deduction of the categories, and he partially rewrote and reorganized his transcendental aesthetics treatment of space and time. Now, the second thing I'd like to tell you about is the overall structure of the critique. The main text Kant calls the transcendental doctrine of elements, and it's divided into the aesthetic and the logic. The aesthetic treats our lower or our animal faculty of cognition, while the logic treats our higher or rational faculty of knowing. The lower faculty Kant calls sensibility. This is our capacity to be affected by objects and to receive representations from being affected by objects. The higher capacity Kant divides into two faculties, the understanding and reason. The understanding is our capacity to apply concepts in making judgments, and reason is our capacity to draw inferences. The analytic treats our faculty of understanding, and the dialectic treats reason. So now, I'd like to look at 4 different ways that Kant frames his project in the critique. The first is in a letter that Kant writes to his friend and former student, Marcus Hertz. Kant writes this letter in 1772, so this is 9 years before the first edition of the critique is published. And in this letter, Kant identifies the problem he plans for the critique to solve. The problem he calls the key to the whole secret of metaphysics. Kant writes, I asked myself this question: what is the ground of the relation of that in us, which we call representation, to the object? So Kant's question is about reference. In virtue of what does my mental representation of this object refer to the object out in the world? Now, Kant thinks it's easy to answer this question in the case of sensuous representations. So Kant writes, if the representation comprises only the manner in which the subject is affected by the object, then it's easy to see how it's in conformity with the object, namely, as an effect accords with its cause. So if I have a representation of this red sphere, we want to know, in virtue of what does my representation refer to this red sphere? Well, Kant thinks in this case, my representation refers to this particular object because this particular object is the cause of our representation. The problem arises in the case of our non-sensuous representations, our concepts, or our a priori concepts in particular. So my concept of redness in general, or my concept of a sphere, or my concept of a cause. If these concepts aren't simply caused by particular objects affecting my senses, then in virtue of what do these concepts refer to any objects out in the world? You could imagine a mind that creates its objects. So Kant thinks that God's mind is like this. When God thinks of the world, he thereby creates the world. And Kant thinks our wills are creative also. If I intend to go ride a bike, my intention can cause me to go ride a bike. But our thoughts aren't creative in this way. If I think of $1 million, I don't thereby have $1 million. So the question is, what's the relationship between our non-sensible concepts and the world, such that our non-sensible concepts are about the world? Now, Kant discusses what he calls a pre-established intellectual harmony theory. On this view, God creates the world and creates our minds, and he creates them so that they match one another. Kant says of this theory that it's viciously circular and that it encourages all sort of pious notion and speculative brainstorm. Now, in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant doesn't refer back to this problem when he's framing his project in the preface and the introduction, but he does return to it in one of the central chapters of the critique, the transcendental deduction. The way Kant frames his project in the A preface of the critique is by calling metaphysics a battlefield and identifying his chief opponents, the dogmatists, the skeptics, and the physiologists. Kant's idea here is that dogmatists assert metaphysical claims, and that they do so without providing a justification. This leaves it open to the skeptics to simply deny the metaphysical claims, though since the skeptics do so without showing that these metaphysical claims couldn't possibly be justified, this leaves it open for the dogmatists to turn around and reassert those metaphysical claims. Kant's prime example of a dogmatist is Leibniz, and its example of a skeptic is Hume. Kant's third sort of opponent is a physiologist, and the example Kant gives here is Locke. The physiologist identifies the cognitive mechanisms involved in forming metaphysical judgments, but Kant wants to sharply distinguish the question of how it is we come to form a particular judgment and what grounds justify that judgment. So Kant thinks the physiologists provide one sort of account of how we come to make metaphysical judgments, a descriptive account, but Kant wants to provide a normative account. Kant isn't seeking to provide an account of the mechanism by which we form judgments, but the rational grounds that justify our judgments. Kant thinks that if we identify the grounds on which metaphysical judgments are justified, then, once and for all, we can prove which metaphysical judgments we do have a rightful claim to make, and which judgments we do not have a rightful claim to make. Okay, but what are metaphysical judgments? Some examples are every event has a cause, every body is in space and time, and God exists. We don't just want a list of examples. We want to know what makes a metaphysical judgment a metaphysical judgment. Kant provides an account of this in the introduction to the critique and in the preamble to the Prolegomena. So here, Kant draws two distinctions among our judgments. The first distinction is between two different sources of our judgments, and the other distinction is between two different sorts of contents of our judgments. So regarding the sources, Kant distinguishes empirical and a priori judgments. Empirical judgments are derived from some particular experience, while a priori judgments are independent of any particular experience. Kant begins the introduction by saying all of our cognition begins with experience as far as time is concerned. So Kant thinks that if I've never had any experiences, then I wouldn't have any cognition whatsoever. So all of our knowledge depends on our having had at least some experience or other. But empirical judgments depend on the particular experiences that I've had. A priori judgments are judgments that would be justified regardless of which experiences I've had. I have to have had some experience in order to have a priori cognition, but it doesn't matter which experiences I've had for my a priori cognition to be justified. As far as the distinction among the contents of our cognition, Kant distinguishes analytic and synthetic judgments, and he gives us three criteria to mark this distinction. First, Kant says that in analytic judgments, the predicate concept is contained in the subject concept. In synthetic judgments, by contrast, the predicate concept is not contained in the subject concept. Second, he says that analytic judgments are true in virtue of the definitions of the terms and the law of identity, or of non-contradiction. Synthetic judgments are not true in virtue of the definitions and the law of non-contradiction. Third, Kant says that analytic judgments just clarify what we already know. They're judgments of clarification, while synthetic judgments are judgments of amplification. Synthetic judgments increase our knowledge. I think it's helpful to consider this chart. So we can see here that analytic a priori judgments are judgments like all bachelors are unmarried or triangles have three angles. These judgments are analytic because the predicate concepts are contained in the subject concepts. Right, the definition of a triangle is a plane figure having three angles. So the predicate, three angles, is already contained in the subject, triangle. If I were to deny that triangles have three angles, I'd be violating the principle of non-contradiction. All analytic judgments are a priori. I don't need to have experienced any particular bachelor or any particular triangle to know that all bachelors are unmarried, or to know that all triangles have three angles. So there are no empirical analytic judgments. All of our empirical judgments are synthetic. So some examples of synthetic empirical judgments are this book is blue, or the professor of this course is bald. The only way you can know that this book is blue, or that the professor of this course is bald, is to have experienced them. The fourth space on this chart is the synthetic a priori. Now Kant thinks that all mathematical judgments and all judgments in natural science are synthetic a priori judgments. So Kant thinks the judgment, the internal angles of a triangle, sum to 180 degrees, is synthetic a priori. We can see that it's synthetic by noticing that it's not in the definition of a triangle for its internal angles to sum to 180 degrees. As we said before, a triangle is defined as a plane figure with three angles. So it isn't true in virtue of the definition of a triangle that its internal angles sum to 180 degrees. Yet, this is something that we know a priori. We can tell that we know this a priori, Kant thinks, because necessity and strict universality are the marks of the a priori. So in the introduction, Kant says that experience teaches us what is, but not what must be, and cannot be otherwise. So I can know by experience that this book is blue, but I could never know by experience that all books are blue, or that books are necessarily blue. Yet I do know that the internal angles of every triangle sum to 180 degrees. So this must be an a priori judgment, because the claim that I'm making outstrips experience. Now Kant thinks that all properly metaphysical judgments are synthetic a priori. Examples are every event has a cause, all bodies are in space and time, and God exists. Now, Kant never doubts that we do have synthetic a priori knowledge in mathematics and natural science. But he distinguishes the analytic method of the prolegomena from the synthetic method of the critique of pure reason by saying that in the prolegomena, we rely on the assumption that we have synthetic a priori knowledge in mathematics and natural science, and seek to identify the source of this knowledge, while in the critique, Kant says, he will take no foundation as given except reason itself. So this is something to keep in mind as we're going forward reading the critique and the prolegomena. We want to notice how Kant relies on mathematics and natural science in the prolegomena, and we want to see whether Kant refrains from relying on mathematics and natural science in the same way in the critique. The fourth passage, in which Kant introduces us to his project in the critique, is in the B preface. Here, Kant compares his approach with that of Copernicus. Kant's thought is that in the pre-Copernican way of thinking, the apparent motion of the sun around the Earth was explained by the sun's actual movement in an orbit around the Earth. Copernicus's revolutionary hypothesis was that the apparent motion of the sun around the Earth was in fact explained by the Earth's movement around the sun. Now, the analogy Kant wants to draw is this. Transcendental realism is the thesis that the objects of our knowledge are what they are, independent of our knowledge, and the way things appear to us has to be explained by the way things independently are. Now, Kant's revolutionary hypothesis is to explain why things appear to us the way they do, not in terms of the way the objects independently are, but in terms of the way that our mind is. Kant thinks that the general structure of the objects in the world can be explained by the forms of the mind. Kant acknowledges that from this revolution in our philosophical approach, there emerges what he calls a very strange result. The result is that our cognition can never be of the way things are, independently of the possibility of our cognition of them. Our cognition can never be of things as they are in themselves. Instead, our cognition is limited to appearances. We can have knowledge only of the objects of our possible experience. Now, this thesis of Kant's, transcendental idealism, is perhaps the most contested thesis of Kant's in the secondary literature. Next week, we'll be looking at the three leading interpretations of this thesis. For this week, in your papers, you might think about how the various ways Kant describes his project fit together. Alternatively, you might look at this passage from the B preface, where Kant proposes his Copernican revolution in metaphysics, and consider to what extent it amounts to an argument for transcendental idealism. Kant says that on the presupposition of transcendental realism, all our attempts to explain how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible have come to nothing. So think, is it impossible to account for synthetic a priori knowledge on the assumption of transcendental realism? If so, does that amount to an argument for transcendental idealism? If it does this argument rely on the assumption that we have synthetic a priori knowledge? And if it does rely on such an assumption, does that mean Kant has already gone back on his promise to refrain from relying on such assumptions in the critique?